Well, thank you for joining me. The title of this section right here is The Journey Up the Hill of Difficulty. I think we'll find some stuff we can relate to in this. So let's get to this today. So in our reading today, it says, they gave him no answer to these things. They just looked at each other and laughed. Then I saw them move on, except for Christian, who walked ahead. He mostly talked to himself, sometimes with a sigh, other times with comfort. He also often read from the scroll given to him by the one in the shining, which refreshed him. I watched as they went on until they reached the base of the hill called Difficulty. At the bottom, there was a spring. There were also two other paths beside the one that led straight from the gate. One path turned left, and the other turned right at the bottom of the hill. But the narrow way went straight up the hill, and that uphill path was called Difficulty. Christian went to the spring, and he drank from it, and it refreshed him. Then he began climbing the hill, saying, "The hill is steep, but I want to climb it. The difficulty won't stop me. I see the path to life lies here. So let's not be discouraged or afraid. Better to take the hard but right way than the easy way that ends in misery." The other two travelers also came to the bottom of the hill. When they saw how steep and how high it was and noticed that there were two other paths, they thought those paths might meet up with Christians on the other side of the hill. So they decided to take the easier routes. One path was called Danger, and the other Destruction. One traveler took the path called Danger, which led into a thick forest. The other took the path called Destruction, which led into a wide open field with dark mountains, where he stumbled and fell, never to rise again. I looked back at Christian, who was climbing the hill. I noticed he slowed from running to a walk, and from walking to a crawl on his hands and knees because of how steep it was. About halfway up the hill, there was a pleasant resting place made by the Lord of the hill for weary travelers. Christian reached it, sat down to rest, and pulled out his scroll from his chest pocket to read for comfort. He also began to admire the coat he was given when he stood at the cross. Pleased with himself, he eventually drifted into a somber and then into a deep sleep, which kept him there until almost nightfall. While he slept, his scroll slipped from his hand. While Christian slept, someone approached him and woke him, saying, "Go to that ant, you sluggard. Consider his ways and be wise." Startled, Christian jumped up, hurried on his way, and moved quickly until he reached the top of the hill. When he reached the top, two men came running towards him. Their names were Timoris and Mistrust. Christian asked them, "What's the matter? You're running the wrong way." Timoris replied that they were headed to the city of Zion, but the farther they went, the more dangers they faced. So they had decided to turn around and go back. "Yes," said Mistrust, "just ahead of us are a couple of lions. We don't know if they're sleeping or awake, but we know if we got too close, they would tear us apart." Christian said, "You're making me afraid, but where can I go to be safe? If I go back to my own country, it is destined for fire and brimstone, and I will surely die there. If I can make it to the celestial city, I will be safe. I must take the risk. To go back is certain death. To go forward means the fear of death, but also everlasting life. I will move forward." With that, Timoris and Mistrust ran back down the hill while Christian continued on. Thinking about what they said, Christian reached for his scroll because he wanted to read to gain some comfort, but he didn't find it there. He was in great distress, not knowing what to do, for he needed the scroll for comfort, and he also needed it to serve as the pass to the celestial city. He was deeply troubled until he remembered that he must have left it at that resting place halfway up the hill. He fell to his knees, asked God to forgive him for his foolishness, and then he went back to look for his scroll. All the way back, Christian's heart was filled with sorrow. Sometimes he sighed, sometimes he wept, and often he scolded himself for falling asleep in a place meant only for a brief rest. He looked carefully around, hoping to find his lost scroll. He kept going until he saw the resting place. But seeing it brought back his regret. As it reminded him of his mistake, he said to himself, "Oh, what a wretched person I am, to sleep during the day, to sleep in the midst of difficulty. How foolish I was to use that resting place for my own comfort, when the Lord of the Hill intended it to be something that would lift my spirit. How many wasted steps have I taken? How far could I have gone if not for my foolish sleep? Oh, now I must travel these steps 3 times when once would have been enough. I may even be stuck traveling in the dark, for the day has almost come to an end. Why did I sleep?" As he arrived at the resting place, where he sat down, he began to weep. He wept bitterly, feeling deep shame and regret for his foolishness. He could remember every detail of how he had drifted off, how he had allowed himself to be lulled by comfort, and how he had failed to be vigilant. These thoughts cut deeply, and he could not help but express his sorrow aloud. "How could I have been so careless?" he said. "I had been warned that the journey would be hard, and yet I chose ease over obedience. How foolish of a person I am." But finally, as by the providence, he looked down and he saw his scroll under the bench. Trembling, he quickly picked it up and put it in his chest pocket. Who could describe his joy at finding his scroll again? It was the assurance of his life and his acceptance at the journey's end. He put it safely in his pocket, thanked God for guiding his eyes to it, and with joy and with tears, he resumed his journey. He climbed the rest of the hill quickly, though his body was weary, as he was now determined to make up for lost time. He muttered to himself, "No more distractions, no more foolishness." He moved with determination, each step deliberate and purposeful. But before he reached the top, the sun set. And this again reminded him of the consequences of his sleep. He said to himself, "Oh, that sinful sleep. Now I must travel in the dark. I must walk without the sun." He could hear the cries of the wild animals, and he stumbled in the darkness because of his foolishness. He also remembered what Timoris and Mistrust had told him about the lions and thought, "Oh, those beasts, they hunt for prey at night. If I meet them in the dark, how will I escape?" His heart pounded, fear mixed with regret. Every rustling of the leaves, every distant howl seemed to echo his worries. As he lamented his mistake, he looked up and he saw a beautiful place called Beautiful standing by the roadside. Its windows glowed warmly, and he could see the faint outlines of people moving about within. Hope flickered in his heart as he hurried towards it, thinking perhaps he might find some safety and comfort there. As Christian approached the palace, he could make out more details. It stood tall, with high walls, adorned with carvings and beautiful decorations. The gate was wide open, and above it, inscribed in gold, were words he couldn't fully make out from afar. He moved closer, his heart filled with anticipation and a little bit of nervousness as well. Would he be allowed to enter? Would this place provide rest for a weary traveler like him? Or would he be turned away? He slowly approached the gatekeeper, who stood watch at the entrance. The gatekeeper saw Christian, and he noticed his tired expression and the look of worry on his face. "Who are you, and what's your purpose here?" the gatekeeper asked. His voice was kind, but it was firm. "I am Christian," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I come seeking refuge and a place of rest. I have been on a long and difficult journey, and I have faced many trials. I was warned of dangers ahead, and I need shelter to continue my journey." The gatekeeper looked him over, noticed the scroll tucked into his chest pocket, and nodded. "You are welcome here," he said. "The Lord of this place has provided rest for travelers like you, those who are determined to press on despite difficulty. Enter, and you will find safety here." With those words, the gatekeeper opened the gate wide, and Christian stepped inside. Inside the palace, Christian found a courtyard full of flowers and fountains and a sense of peace that just settled over him. He could hear music from within the palace halls, and laughter echoed in the distance. The warmth of the place wrapped around him like a comforting blanket, and he felt the heaviness of his earlier mistakes begin to lift. He was led to a room where he could wash and rest. As he settled in for the night, he prayed, thanking God for providing a refuge when he needed it the most. And so Christian rested, with the palace beautiful, standing as a beacon of hope on his journey. He knew that he would need to continue climbing, and that more trials were certainly laying ahead. But for now, he was content. He had learned a hard lesson, and he vowed not to fall into that same trap again. With his scroll safely in hand and his heart filled with new determination, he would move forward, trusting that the Lord would guide his every step, even through the darkest nights. So why is it that sometimes following Jesus, we go straight uphill? It gets very hard and very difficult. Well, one of the reasons is because when we find ourselves in that position, then we have to rely on God and His strength. And when we rely on God and His strength to carry us through, to give us strength to do things in and of ourselves we can't do, then ultimately what it does is it builds our faith and it builds our trust in Him. Sometimes, man, there's places and areas we've got to go when we're following Jesus where we can't make it on our own. So God is always building our faith, building our trust, and helping us to understand that living in the kingdom is not the easy life, but it's the best life, because it's a life filled with trust and it is a life filled with faith.